Thanks so much, Amanda. I really appreciate the introduction, and hopefully my slides are showing up here. So as Amanda noted, we're working on a kind of interesting side of the climate finance space, and there's a lot of information here that we'll get into today. But kind of at the end of the day, the core thesis is that right now there is a tremendous amount of capital sitting in traditional financial management. Just across the United States alone, corporates have more than $7 trillion in cash and investments. And right now, those are largely being kind of ignored as a climate vehicle. And the purpose of our work is very much to mobilize that capital and to think through how do you build and structure financial products and services that can help ensure that the everyday cash and investments of companies like Microsoft or Amazon or Google are being used to accelerate climate mitigation rather than being used to accelerate climate change. And so this work for us started in 2021 when we started talking to some of the largest companies in the world. We started just sort of wondering, like, if Bill McKibben is telling me, Paul, that where I bank matters, like and I count my money in the thousands, like what does that mean for a Google or a Microsoft that counts their money by the billions, if not tens of billions? And so we kind of started asking three relatively simple questions, which were one, are climate leading companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft working to align their banking and investing with their corporate climate goals? We had read through their sustainability reports and there was not much information in there. Two, could we measure the emissions enabled by these companies' cash and investments? And if so, like how big are they and how do they compare to their other emission sources? And then three, how do they fit into the global emissions reporting frameworks? Is it part of Scope 3? Initially, we were thinking of it as like, was this a Scope 5 emission, which was way too far down the rabbit hole. But so to kind of understand what was in part motivating us to do this research was a couple of sort of recognitions that we had about the state of the financial system, which is that one, the financial sector is on a dangerous climate trajectory right now. It is not aligned with meeting our global climate goals and continues to drive investment at way too aggressive a rate into climate destruction and not nearly as accelerated enough into climate progress. And on top of that, a lot of lagging in terms of quality reporting and quality sort of work around transparency. Secondly, despite mounting pressure from governments and entities like GFANs and others, there's insufficient pressure to drive rapid transformation of this sector. And then thirdly, that companies, because they are the largest cash holders in the world and have, some of them, these companies have, more money in them than even the most well-endowed foundations, et cetera, do, our universities, that they, in fact, can play a very pivotal role accelerating the decarbonization of the financial sector by applying the same engagement approaches that they use to decarbonize everything else in their supply chain, but apply it to their banks. And so to quickly kind of take a step back, it's just kind of important to recognize the role that banks play driving our climate future. And they really are this incredible pivot point, because for companies, they generate cash, or for individuals, and I should say this applies to foundations, universities, cities, nonprofits, et cetera, is that when you generate cash and you go and you deposit in a bank, that money doesn't just sit in the bank account accruing interest. Banks lend that money across the economy. And some of that money, it flows to kind of everything across the economy. So some of it flows to mortgages, others flows to commercial lending, but a lot of it is flowing into fossil fuels at way too high of a rate. But at the same time, those money is also flowing into climate solutions at not fast enough of a rate. And so to that respect, as we look at the sort of global climate transition, recognizing that there's $196 trillion of investment that needs to be made into climate solutions, our banks are playing a hugely important pivot point, because they're either continuing to invest in climate drivers that are going to lock in and funding and underwriting infrastructure that's going to lock in decades of emissions, or they're going to fund things that are leading to climate mitigation and lock in decades of progress on that front. And so if you take a look at what the sort of impact of the financial sector, so just the largest 60 banks alone since the Paris Agreement was signed have invested more than $5.5 trillion in fossil fuel. And that across all financial institutions, so banks, asset managers, and insurance companies, they cumulatively have more than $22 trillion in exposure to the most carbon intensive sectors. And then this is the sort of like scary part of the banking part is when we talk to people about their banking and their emissions, most people think of it as the bank branches are all of the data centers that it takes to power, Chase's online portfolio. But it turns out that 700 times the emissions of all of that is their lending. And so when a bank is lending out, that money, it is generating 700 times more emissions than everything else they're doing combined. And so when you look at this from the macro sort of paradigm, and there's some controversy, I should say, around these numbers, but broadly speaking, we know that by 2030, we need to be getting to a place where banks are investing $4 in clean energy and clean climate solutions to every dollar in dirty, more carbon intensive infrastructure. That's where we need to be by 2030. And right now, we're at basically 73 cents to every dollar. And so we need to do a radical transformation of how banks are lending and directing money if we are going to have any hope of meeting our global climate goals. And so to go back to these three questions that we started asking, which once again, were sort of this idea of like, how do we get companies to be engaged in this fight and to use their consumer power to push banks in the right direction? The data around this was pretty staggering. So for many companies, when we calculated their emissions, we found that it was one of, if not their largest source of emissions, if not larger than all of their other emissions combined. Two, that very few companies, we went and spoke with every one of pretty much the largest companies based in the US, and very few, if any of them, were even thinking about their banking as a climate lever, yet alone doing anything about it. There were a few exceptions, and they would be the ones that you might expect, like a Patagonia as an example. And three, when we went and started talking with the World Resource Institute around where this fits within the GHG protocol, we found that they had always thought of corporate cash and investments as part of Scope 3, Category 15. They just haven't actually required companies or organizations to report any of this data because they never had the data or methodology. And so that's very much like in part where we're focused on sort of solving this problem is building out those data and methodological solutions. And so just to kind of do a deeper dive into the data real quickly, and I'll try to fly through this so we're not spending too much time talking through the data side of this all. But essentially, when we went and we looked at companies, and this was a most recent, Amanda referenced the Carbon Bankroll report, which we initially published with this data in 2022. We just published an updated version of the report in 2024, or just last March. That has much more comprehensive data set, and it's much more sort of involved in the solution side of what do you actually do about this, and features a lot of the great work that some leading companies like Atlassian and 7th Generation and Patagonia are doing. But essentially across all of these companies featured here, so Airbnb, Amazon, Apple, et cetera, that when you start looking at their financed emissions, so the emissions that stem from their banking and investing, it represents about 76% of their reported emissions. And there's huge variance in this number, and it's in part based on like the carbon intensity of companies' businesses. So like Amazon, for example, more carbon intensive business than MasterCard. So there's a huge variance there. But even for Amazon, their banking and investing represents their third largest source of emissions. And for leading companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Netflix, Salesforce, their banking and investing is not only their largest source of emissions, but larger than all of their emissions combined. And part of the reason that's the case is because when these companies are putting money in their banks, about 20 to 30% of all of that money is flowing into the world's most carbon intensive sectors. And so if you look at why these companies should care about it, it's like, one, not only is it driving major emissions, but two, these companies are spending all of this time and energy working to ensure that the flow of capital is within their entire ecosystem is flowing towards climate solutions. But meanwhile, they're making billions of dollars in profits and putting that money in banks, not paying any attention to it, and passively undermining a lot of their climate ambitions because they're indirectly lending their money to large fossil fuel companies and other large-scale industrial carbon-intensive projects. And then reason three, and I sort of personally love this example. We haven't published this, but it's essentially to say that companies' financial management is undermining their climate work. And so if you're Google and you've got whole teams of people that are working to make your phones more carbon friendly and to get the emissions that go into manufacturing the hardware, like it's really great that they're doing that. But meanwhile, their banking and investing is generating 2x the emissions of everything else they're doing as a company. And I think kind of the best example of this is Tesla. I should note that these are like indicative estimates based on our analysis, but essentially in 2023, Tesla sold 1.8 million new vehicles based on just an average of EVs in the US reduce emissions by 3.3 tons when you switch from a traditional ICE vehicle into a electric vehicle. That means that they're going to be reducing annually about 6 million tons of emissions a year, metric tons a year, and that their finance emissions, so just their banking and investing, once again, the passive investments in that is generating 6.3. So that all of the work that they're doing to reduce emissions through the sales of record EVs that they had in 2023, it's still the indirect, and once again, indirect scope 3 emissions as opposed to direct scope 1 emissions of these individuals, their cars. But broadly speaking, like their banking and investing is undoing a tremendous amount of all of the good that they're doing. And so our hope and the work that we're doing, which is really focused on not just building out this data, but working with companies. We're currently engaged with companies with more than $500 billion in cash and investments around how they can work to decarbonize their banking and investing and leverage their consumer power to engage with their banks and push them to be more climate aligned. But we are working to ensure that by 2028, and we believe that this will be the case, it'll become standard practice for all responsible companies and organizations to actively work to align their financial management with their core sustainability and social objectives. And so that means that everything from their cash management to their insurance to their 401ks to the mortgage-backed securities that they're investing in, et cetera, are aligned with their climate values, or at least that they're trending in the direction that they will be, and that they're applying not only just green screens, but an active view of how do we use our financial management to drive real world decarbonization. And so very text heavy slide here for presentation, but just to say that we have mapped out this sort of the roadmap for what this looks like, and we're actively working with companies to do this. And so I know everybody here is sort of representing more from the sort of academic side of this, but I should say, so all this should be applied to universities and their foundations, their endowments as well. And so it's really about thinking through this process of how do you create internal alignment within your company or organization? How do you sort of do that evaluative work of your financial supply chain? And really do this engagement part and sort of move through this 7-stage process of working to align your banking and investing with your climate values. Patrick Flint, who is the former global head of sustainability for Salesforce, who's our corporate climate lead. When we met with him initially, he was leading everything at Salesforce on the sustainability front, and they had never looked at their banking and investing at all. And what he says is, knowing what I know now, I think that our banking and investing is not only our most important supply chain partner, but our most impactful lever for being able to drive the global transition. And so really hope this work resonates with you, and wanted to let you know that we are here as a resource. And so this is my email. You can find me here at paul@topofinance.org. You can find all of our work at topofinance.org. And if there's anything we can do to help your organizations on this front, we provide free consulting services to companies and organizations to help them get started on this work. And so really appreciate the time today and happy to answer any questions.